Thank you everyone for being here today. I'm really pleased that we have so many people interested in not only data, which happens to be a bit of a difficult topic for quite a few people outside of science, but also how to make that data easy to understand, approachable, and useful for both individuals that use the data and also the ones that can benefit from the outputs of that data. So NGOs, journalists, policymakers, teachers, you name it, but let's try and see what can we do with that longitudinal data so that it becomes impactful. So, one of the reasons I think that is really important to talk about longitudinal data is the thinking that it provides us. So essentially, this thinking comes from the fact that social phenomena are actually quite ambiguous. They're very difficult to understand, especially if you look at those phenomena at a very certain point in time. But when you develop the time perspective, when you accumulate data, the time flowing by, you can see the developments, be it in societies, be it individual lives, be it in specific topics of, retirement, fertility intentions, or poverty. Because this time perspectives allows us to look at these phenomena from different points of view. It gives us different angles and allows us to actually understand how we reach to a certain point, how we reach to coming of age, how we formed our families, how we decided to retire. So that is a very important element of what longitudinal data can give us, but it also is an important element of policies. With longitudinal data, we can actually design policies that have impact. This data allows us to have causal relationships. It allows us to look at when inequality started, when the outcomes that we observe 60 years in the future actually started. Was it childhood? Was it mid-age? Was it actually very recent? This is really important when we want to actually change our societies. This is really important when we want to go ahead and have meaningful contributions to the public field of discussions about certain societal topics. So that all can be derived from longitudinal data and try getting in further in its use. Today we met as a group of people who have a few questions about longitudinal data and its use in the wider non-academic environment. Some of those topics are a bit more technical, such as attrition or weighting the data, but a lot of those topics, as you can see in this word cloud, are actually related to how do we make this outcome of using longitudinal data, our research actionable? How can we make it understandable? How can we communicate the findings? How can we visualize those findings? Long story short, how can we make it easy, understandable, and useful for the work that we do outside of science? So during today's webinar, the goals are essentially aligned with what you as participants indicated as interests. So we will try learning more about longitudinal data and how can that type of data be used for policy, but also how to communicate and use the data to a degree that is beneficial for our communication activities and also for our impact goals. To better understand the longitudinal data and its benefits, I think it's really important to actually have one theoretical building block that is called the life course perspective or life course logic. It is a simple but naturally beautiful concept. The simplicity comes from the fact that the life course perspective approaches human life not as isolated events, but as a sequence of different events, a sequence of transitions. So that really is a point that takes into account human life from the very beginning till the very end. These sequences can be defined roughly by main important life course events. So scientifically speaking, there are some that are more pronounced than the others. So for example, a life course event is leaving parental home. finding a first job, finishing education, rather than having a cup of coffee. Just to give you, an understanding that these events happen sometimes in your life, once if you know, become alive when your mother gives birth to you or when you die. They do not happen that often. So we want to look at those important life course events, such as the mentioned ones of, family formation, education, or getting a first job, and then try to understand how these events work in a sequence, whether they influence each other or not, and how can we really change those life outcomes if we want to. So with the life course perspective, we can do that. This is a theoretical building block that allows us to see at sequences, interactions between those sequences, rather than just isolated singular events that have nothing to do with each other. And to give you an example, which I think is quite important for different types of socially oriented professionals, is inequalities. So a lot of the time, life cost perspective is also useful to understand inequalities. Imagine if an individual does not have a chance to finish their high school, finish education. So that's essentially the very first X. Does that mean that they can find a job, leave parental home? Well, maybe they can find a job. Maybe they can leave their home, what the first family was created. But with the longitudinal data, we can actually see whether other life domains get affected. So, for example, the second X here is actually forming a partnership. In this theoretical example, the idea is that inequalities can really start early on. And those inequalities that individuals experience in their lives earlier can really drag on throughout their life and have impact on the other life course events, other choices, other important domains of their lives, without necessarily them knowing that. So in this particular example, if individuals cannot finish high school, potentially they cannot form partnership. And there are many, 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 many other different examples where longitudinal data can allow us to see whether these accumulated inequalities, inability to finish high school, get proper nutrition, get good healthcare, can influence other later life events, outcomes, or goals for these individuals. So that is why policy also benefits from this approach and from this type of data. Policy can influence these negative outcomes. So if this example that I've been showing you now is that someone cannot finish high school because they do not have the adequate resources, for example, policy could address this issue and provide resources, be it necessary healthcare if that's health related, be it financial aid if that's related to finances or very specific help such as accommodation, housing, or food stamps in some cases, to be very, very specific. The idea here is that in case individuals that participate unintended or unwanted drawbacks in life get help from policies, they can potentially forego the negative outcomes of these early on inequalities that build on and then end up having lives similar to the other individuals that did not necessarily have to struggle in certain points in life. So essentially here, the ones that could have finished high school and then later on had their lives transitioning the order they intended them to go. So in a nutshell, life course is a useful approach because it talks about dynamics, it talks about sequences, and it also indicates that what happened in the past may affect the future. Pretty simple, pretty beautiful, but it also is only actionable if you can use the right data sources. If you can use the data sources that are applicable, and these data sources, as you can already guess, are longitudinal data sources. Again, leveraging the information about our group, a lot of you already have familiarity with the longitudinal data sources. That is great. That is great that you are here to go on and learn how that data can be used not only for science, but I wanted to make sure that we are on the same page. So very, very quickly, a few words about what longitudinal data actually means. It is also a simple concept, very, very simple indeed, because essentially it means that it is data that is collected from the same individual in our social cases or a household, if we're talking about broader groups of people at the very repeated time. So, for example, if you talk about a census, well, that's usually every 10 years. And then everyone in the country who is accessible practically gets to answer the census or gets the data collected from registers to form a census. Similarly, this is how surveys work. Surveys approach same individuals every X number of years, be it 3 years, be it 5 years, be it every 6 months, and ask questions to those individuals. So later on, we end up with data sets that really, take into account long time frames, many transitions of those individuals, many changes in their lives, and it really enlightens the life goals discussion that we earlier introduced. And again, this is really important because unlike the cross-sectional data that takes snapshots of different groups at different times, longitudinal data takes into account same individuals at a certain time, and it allows us to see trajectories rather than stable pictures. So I guess one of the easiest examples here is thinking about longitudinal data as film. So they unfold, they roll, they really are active, and you see how stories develop. Whilst cross-sectional data is something more of a picture. You have it, and you know what happened at that point in time. So you remember your 18th birthday with a picture, but you not necessarily know how you reached that 18th birthday if there were no videos, let's call it that way. So today I just wanted to remind the group of four, I want to say particularly interesting types of longitudinal data for social scientists. So those being the following. The first one is the individual level panel studies. Those studies can be the surveys that I already mentioned. Those surveys that could be the Kronos that Irina had mentioned in the very beginning. It can also be share. Another survey that I will also later on show to you can be other surveys that essentially fall in the definition of individual level panel studies, where individual is provided with a questionnaire every X years to answer the questions. Cohort studies focus on a group of people that are defined by age. So, for example, if we're talking about Gen Z, a subsample of Gen Z individuals in the United Kingdom could be selected, and then they would be approached every, again, X years and would be asked certain questions. Household panel studies actually focus on the individuals living in the same household. So here you go and sample households and ask questions to households, that is individuals who live in those households, and carry on with your timeline. Record linkages are also quite interesting. I think they're growing now in number. These are data sets that are put together using different admin sources. So, for example, some of the censuses are not really done face-to-face anymore or online. They are essentially done leveraging information from different registers. So be it already, household registers, could be health registers or admin data. It could also be tax authorities data. So you put it together and then you do get an image of a group of people in society that does not necessarily require getting in touch with these individuals directly. Right, but it's great to know that there are different types of longitudinal data, but what is the power of those longitudinal data? Um, I've been talking about sequence a lot, and I think that's one of the main points I'd like to, you take away today. With longitudinal data, you know what action led to an outcome. So, to put it simply, with longitudinal data, the hope is we don't end up with chicken and egg of situation. We know that you had to be born to, go to school, but we also know that if you were not able to finish high school, potentially you were not able to go to university. And those are the actions and outcomes that I'm talking about. It also is a great source because essentially people tend to forget things. If you ask some things about their past, they might already not remember a lot. So that's where the 18th birthday film comes in. If you have it filmed, you know that, or you had a great time and when you were 10 at this party as well, at your birthday party. But if you don't have it filmed, you might end up thinking, well, it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. You don't necessarily remember what happened. So if someone asked about it, we would not be able to tell precisely what cake you had, for example. While this is, a bit of childish example, it is a great example of how people forget things if they don't take note of it. So the bias of recall can really be reduced when you have longitudinal data and you ask people about their life transitions and their important life events at a set frequency. We talked already about early divergence of individuals, so I think that's one of the major social science themes of research, not even topics. So with longitudinal data, we can already understand, well, when one group starts diverging from the other. This is what inequalities start developing. Doesn't have to be educational that I kept referring to, can be health inequalities. And we know what actions might influence not only socioeconomic backgrounds. So that is also a great and powerful tool element of longitudinal data that we can leverage as opposed to other data sources. Well, and then policies, one of the main goals today is also talking about policymakers and how this data can help them. With longitudinal data, we know that we can track when policy was introduced. If food stamps were introduced in 2015 and we collected data in 2010 and 2020, we know that we can go and see whether the food stamps help people with lower socioeconomic backgrounds to, carry on with educational trajectories, to use the previous example. So this is really important because other data would be proxies, other data would be inferring. So it's a bit of a different quality that longitudinal data can really, provide in comparison to other data sources. So quite a few of benefits that we can get from these types of data. But I think it's also important, to go and trigger the creative thinking of what we can work on with this data. What really are the questions that can be best answered using this type of data? So I also have four groups. Some of those we've already covered a lot, especially the inequalities. But intentions are one of the important sets of questions in quite a few of panel studies, household studies, cohort studies. So, people intend to do many things in their lives. They intend to retire early. That would be also great. They intend to change jobs. They intend to migrate, have children, form families. These are life course events that are important for scientists and policymakers. With longitudinal data, you get to ask those questions, but you also get to see whether those intentions got filled, whether they really became true. With that data, you can look back and see whether someone who said that they intend to retire by the age of 55 actually did that. Also, this is a great source of data to see whether shocks or reforms, so policies had an impact. If you introduce accessibility to particular types of screenings, for example, cancer screenings, and then see if later on that had an impact on certain groups, that this is a data source that you would really benefit from longitudinal data rather than cross-sectional or other types of data. So it also has a predictability power. It's longitudinal data is also used for that. It's a bit more of it's a bit more of a tool that tries to look forward. But I think that's also an area in which a lot of research can be done. So researchers working in this field, I think they can very much invited to carry on. In comparison to other questions that I showed or discussed today, I think this is one of the lesser research areas. But let me give you an example how this longitudinal data can inspire science and later on give us examples for policy interventions or actions if you work for an NGO. This particular case study has been adapted by Population Europe, a think tank, and comes from a paper by Van der Linde and co-authors in the Journal of Gerontology, and it looks at pathways to frailty. The important bit here is that the authors look at childhood socioeconomic conditions, so essentially early life socioeconomic background, and how that influences later life health. So, when you become old, how your experience of early life defined your health. So we know already from the literature that childhood is a very important period. People are most fragile then. And socioeconomic conditions actually influence quite a lot later life health outcomes, not necessarily latest. So the authors wanted to know if this persists to the older age, not only midlife. And they also highlighted that there are several important points why we want to know that as a society. So in the societies that have a higher number of frail individuals happen to be less healthy. Frailty naturally can be connected to lower life satisfaction, especially among lower individuals, also different types of life satisfaction outcomes. It could be loneliness, it could be depressive outcomes. So it really has a plethora of, let's call them unwelcome impacts to individual life. And these two categories put together also connect to higher healthcare needs. To address the frailty issues and lower life satisfaction, higher healthcare needs become reality, and this has to be addressed by policymakers and healthcare staff. So really, how can we connect these two elements, right? How can we go and see whether the early childhood socioeconomic conditions had a connection to late life health, the geriatric health? So authors leveraged the available longitudinal data that also had information on the life course of those individuals. So essentially, that was shared data that looks at individuals age 50 and older, but also has information on, the transitions, right? So some information on their childhood, some information on their adulthood, and also outcomes later in life. They analyzed the data, which is obviously an important step, and then shared the results. The results are the following, that both men and women who grew up disadvantaged socioeconomically suffered high odds of being frail or pre-frail in the later life. It's an important finding, and that finding is very actionable. They also managed to identify what needs to be done and how it has to change. So they had, let's say, two categories of suggestions. One was immediate, so to improve public health conditions in later life. So that's something that can be done at a and deliver visible outcomes quite fast, but also improve socioeconomic conditions throughout the life course, which is essentially an indication of change needed for other generations, other cohorts that were not captured by the study. So while this is naturally a very scientific paper, it has implications on how a good data set can prescribe policies to both individuals that experience this negative outcome or negative experience, but also to prevent others from experiencing it. Now, I've been talking a lot about the data. Okay, I gave you this example in the case study of shared data, which happens to be, the biggest social science panel survey in Europe. But there are also other longitudinal data sets that cover the whole life course. These are important players in both policy, societal work, but science too. Here you see the graph that indicates what research infrastructures cover what parts of life course of individuals in Europe. So you have Guide growing up in digital Europe that will collect data. They unfortunately don't yet have the data on early life in Europe. We have the Generations and Gender program that focuses primarily on midlife from 18 to 59, sometimes older individuals. And you have Share that covers uh, European populations 15 plus, as mentioned before. It also has information on people's previous experiences. European Social Survey, or particularly as we're talking about longitudinal data, ESS Chronos, can provide background of values contexts these Europeans and these individuals live in, making and finalizing this whole image of European cross-nationally comparable longitudinal data sets. There are many more at the national level, but as we're a bunch of people coming from different backgrounds, I think we would benefit most knowing these four data sets. Three of those already provide data to researchers, policymakers, NGOs. So just following the logic of life course, as Guy does not yet have data, GGP provides data for life course, and you can access it essentially following the websites of Generations and Gender program. There's a section where you can log in. I'd like to use the pointer, but I don't think I can. So this is where you can log in, register, and receive the data for your research, be it academic or policy work. Share, as mentioned, focusing on individuals 50 plus. The process is pretty similar. You go online on Share website, press on data, and if you're not a user yet, you can register to become a user. Similarly to GGP, you have to provide your information on affiliations, website, but in this case also indicate a preliminary reason why you would be working with shared data and why shared data is the source that you need. You also have Chronos. Chronos has now three, I hope that's the right vocabulary, three ways, but Irina has already mentioned it. It's also a source, a longitudinal source that covers a selected number of European countries, and you can access it through ESS as usual, SIG platform. You also have to register, and you'll be able to download the data. So these are three already available cross-nationally comparable data sources. They focus on different life course periods, but they also have thematic differences. In some cases, GGP focuses more on family issues and generational connections, to be more sociological, let's call it that way. Share has a lot of information on retiring, health, and aging of Europeans and covers the whole European continent plus Israel. Chronos, as mentioned, does have a set of questions that keep changing, but they all very much are related to normative behaviors, values, actions that people take, prefer, and provide great source of information about that part of social life. Now, potentially last but not least, before we go into a discussion, and I do understand that it could also be one of the most awaited sections of this webinar, is the communication bit. So how do you communicate what you find with your longitudinal data sets? We already know that there are so many topics that individuals researchers can work on with these data sets. There are many data sets at the European level that we already discussed, but there are also even more data sets at national level. So it does really provide us with a conundrum. How do we really make sense of this work that we do? How do we really navigate this area by selecting what is important to research? That's one of the questions I think I also recently received. There's so much data, so little time, and we can work on so many topics. So I hope that we can, address not only how to effectively address the communication of longitudinal data and outcomes that we get using this data, but also how to, plan our agendas when we research and we want our research to have an impact. I tried thinking how to make this simple. What would be the main principles for effective longitudinal data communication? And it took me a while to come up with this acronym. That sounds nice because it says acts, so you really have to make sure that your findings are actionable, but it also provides a bit more flesh to it. So, actionable findings in your work, I think, is one of the important things that when you want to, make your cause visible, be it NGOs, be it connection with policymakers, but science increasingly as well has to have both an ambition but a measurable outcome. How this research that social scientists at least do can change the communities, societies, certain groups that they work with and on. So the findings that you end up having in your work need to actually be prescriptive. So coming back to the example of older life frailty and socioeconomic um, struggles in the example before, I think the idea there is that when you produce an outcome, it's important to say and translate that outcome to what needs to be done. So if you remember, the idea was you have to address the challenges that the healthcare systems have to really accommodate frailty of these individuals, one, and two, to come up with policies that really can reduce the early life socioeconomic disparities. So even if these are still broad and not necessarily, fleshed out into small steps, this is a great message when you start a discussion as with decision makers, policymakers, NGOs, or if you are an NGO or researcher with a social agenda. Um, Actionable findings over complicated processes and complicated methods. Clarity in visuals is something else that I think we need to discuss. So think about your audiences when communicating longitudinal data, but not necessarily. I think that's universally applicable. And think about means that you're going to use when addressing those audiences. So today, I am online. I am with you, primarily people working in academic, non-academic research. So I know that some detail and some complicated vocabulary would not make you, lose a track of thought. But if I were talking to someone else, if I were talking to, for example, high school students, that would be a different approach altogether. Same with visuals. I know that I'm online. I also understand that a few people in every group are visual learners, so providing visuals is important. And also because we're online, it's important to have some text. But if you were face to face, a lot of the time, it's important to have as little text as possible and have as few visuals as possible. Those visuals also have to be clear, convoluted visuals are your enemy. I do not have examples of bad visuals today, but I think you could also do a little bit of research if you think that's something you want to, you know, um, spend some time on, because essentially simple is good, complicated makes things lose the main idea. Trajectories. That is very specific to longitudinal data sets. Here, I think the benefit of communicating your work when it's done on longitudinal data is leveraging that it does not come in isolation. Saying that it's a timeline, saying that events that happened in the past have impact on today or will have impact on the future. If you manage to visualize it, that's even better. That is something that is unique to these data sets, and I think that is something that really makes it stand out. Later, we'll talk a little bit about different groups of stakeholders or individuals that you might be engaging, and I think it will be a bit more clear what I mean by trajectories and specific groups. And simplified mechanisms is the last point. While simplicity holds across the board, mechanisms that we use in research are not necessarily easy to understand, even if we've been using them for decades. When talking to people outside of research, it's important that they don't get drowned in detail, quite the opposite. We want them to see simplicity. So if you really need to show how, let's say, the introduction of food stamps affected the benefits to later life health, better have a short line, a couple of visuals, plus and minus, rather than an equation that you developed and explaining the different variables in your equation and how they change when you introduce different covariates. So simplicity again over difficulty. So all in all, ACTS is something that has helped me in the past. This set of letters can grow, I think, in the future, need be, but actionable findings, clarity in visuals, showing trajectories, and simplifying mechanisms is something that usually makes things better rather than worse. A bonus here is that if you want to make your life easy, especially with visualizations and communications of different types of data, but particularly longitudinal data, you can use different existing tools. You can see that what I have on the very bottom are already used and shown slides to you. I wanted to slowly introduce it throughout the duration of our conversation, well, webinar, the conversation will follow, so that you know that it's really quite easy. I got this data recently. I managed to go and put some of the words into the WooClap to have the word cloud. In some cases, depending on how many values you have, it becomes bigger. It's an easy tool. You can benefit from it. I used a data wrapper for the graph in the middle. And then the last picture of the example of visualization of the life course comes from ChatGPT. If you have access to Tableau, I think that's even a better tool that is really simple to visualize and use data, and actually advises you and gives hints how to better use it. So that's a great tool. If you decide not to use these easy tools, if you're more of a person who ends up with Python or R for data visualization, so make sure that you do your research. What has been used in the past? What also make a decision what is simple. Heat maps, for example, are great. Although they show correlations, they're also good for longitudinal data. They're easy to understand, but if you end up with a complicated visualization with different graphs for, I don't know, 17 countries and change in time, that could be really, difficult to understand and convoluted. So yeah, think about your trade-offs, and in case you can use the simpler online tools, I recommend those to you. Now, the very last bit here, and I hope I will not take too much time, is the groups of people to whom you can communicate your longitudinal data-based results. I start with policymakers, and I immediately want to say that if you want to communicate to policymakers, and like unless they already indicated what information they want, it's good call to go and research what they work on. If you want to reach out to your member of parliament because you've done great research on integration of immigrants into labor market in the past 20 years, great. Make sure that member of parliament really works on those topics. If you happen to know that they will be working on these topics, it's even better. That is, of course, a bit difficult if you don't know these people. But a lot of the agendas are online. A lot of the committee agendas are also online, and you can go and see if that is something that your work could, be put forward to. They can benefit from your work. There are different ways of how you communicate to policymakers, decision takers. Know that they don't have much time. If you see them face to face, great. Have a 1 minute, potentially even better, 30-second elevator pitch on your research, who you are, your research, how you can help them. But most of the time, we don't really meet politicians, be it in the elevators or on the streets. So one pages have been used in the past. A lot of the time, they're useful. Policy briefs, they have to be nicely done. They have to be straight to the point, written in the easily understandable language, draw attention to the information that you want to draw attention to. Use visuals, but be easy to understand. This might require some graphical design skills, but with Canva, mentioned before in these slides, that is not necessarily the most difficult thing without the help of a professional. These can be sent in via email. This can be given out if you have meetings. Even though we have been becoming digital for so long, people still appreciate having something to touch. So if you have a meeting, sometimes it's a good idea to bring something printed out to that meeting. NGO is a bit of a difficult group in a sense that to define a tool that could be mostly beneficial for them. The previous bits, of course, qualify for NGOs too, but long-term impact narratives is something that I wanted to highlight. NGOs a lot of the time have reasons why they work on some particular topic. They work on a topic for a very long while, like think about Transparency International, a global NGO that aims to reduce corruption across the world. They will have that topic, and while it's not necessarily a straight connection to life cause, but they do want to have longitudinal data from the same countries. They really think about that. So, like a narrative that lasts a long time, showing the impact, showing that something that in your research has, identified an issue and a long-lasting impact to societal outcomes is important when you approach NGOs. If you work with journalists, or if you are a journalist, I think simplicity still holds as a main rule. On the left-hand side, you see that this is a graph using longitudinal data and for selected countries. Simple line, nothing too complicated. Two different measures: labor market statistics versus socioeconomic dislocation. That's easier to understand, although it comes from Financial Times, so that's the readership that's a bit more data savvy. The other one is a map of France. This, in some cases, can be done with R, in some cases with Tableau. Maps overall are great. They appreciate it a lot by many different stakeholders, not only if you're a journalist or if you send something to a journalist. This map is about the 2017 presidential elections in France. And lastly, teachers, in case you happen to be a lecturer or high school teacher or just an educator, well, not just, but like a teacher of general sort, an educator. Life course is a great approach to data, but it's a great approach to storytelling. Stories are great. People remember when you tell them something in a context, in a timeline. Here I picked something on Lionel Messi. while it's not necessarily a very sociological approach to Lionel Messi, but it does have life goals applied to it. So some of those cards, if you had the interactive case, you would be able to press on them and see that Lionel Messi is 170 centimeters tall, and that is because that he apparently did not live in the did not have access to best foods, or his socioeconomic background wasn't as beneficial as other people in early life. So the other things are more related to other outcomes, but it still makes a great story because you do have longitudinal story that comes and tells how different outcomes in life can be interrelated, be it socioeconomic background in early childhood or winning different football awards. So think about these examples. I'm sure that now you'd rather ask questions rather than listen to me. I'm very, very happy that you have found the time today, and I hope that this has been useful and looking forward to the discussion.